The Russo-Ukrainian War, Getting into Vladimir Putin's Head. Part 3. So what is Vladimir Putin really thinking? Hello, this is John Hnatio reporting for the Objective News Network. Welcome back to the final segment of our three-part series, The Russo-Ukrainian War, Getting into Vladimir Putin's Head. In part 1 of our short series, we told you a little bit about Vladimir Putin's childhood, education, and his early career with the KGB. In part 2, we very briefly looked at some of the things that may have shaped President Putin's current worldview. In part 3, we are going to very briefly delve into what Vladimir Putin may be really thinking as he wages his war of aggression on Ukraine. So let's begin by typing in the question, is President Putin a butcher or a Russian patriot? Immediately authentication brings us this data set at WION News, an Indian news outlet entitled Vladimir Putin, a statesman, warrior, or war criminal. This well-written piece by Akal Malhotra gives us a little bit of a twist from the types of articles we typically see in the Western press. Malhotra is a former Indian diplomat with no apparent dog to hunt in Russo-American affairs. Malhotra begins by telling us, and I quote, President Vladimir Putin has been at the helm of affairs in Russia uninterruptedly for over 2 decades, since 1999, when he was appointed Russia's prime minister by then President Boris Yeltsin. Within a year, he was elected as Russia's president, close quote. Malhotra says that as Putin's influence and control over Russia grew, he gradually became a force to be reckoned with on the global stage. We are told that under Putin's leadership, and again I quote, a systematic campaign was launched to defame Putin, close quote. Again, according to Malhotra, and I quote, more often than not, these attributes are derogatory in nature and range between autocrat, dictator, aggressive narcissist, raging bully, ruthless demolisher of opponents, one who has presided over the systematic dissolution of democracy and institutes of governance, and so on. Close quote. Yes, Malhotra agrees Vladimir Putin may have had a difficult childhood and that he was bullied, but he reminds us that young Putin learned judo to protect himself and learned that if a fight cannot be prevented, it is better to throw the first punch. But Malhotra contends that this does not make Putin a madman. Malhotra goes on to tell us, and again I quote, even as acting president in 1999, Putin had expressed his desire for close cooperation with Europe, and even did not rule out the possibility of joining NATO. In the wake of 9/11, Putin had offered all possible assistance to the USA in her war on terrorism. It is now only a matter of speculation as to what would have been the state of global political and security affairs if the West had responded to Putin's early gesture and disbanded NATO in the wake of the collapse of the USSR and consequent dissolution of the rival Warsaw Pact, and had incorporated Russia into a new security structure for the Euro-Atlantic as an equal and respected member, close quote. An interesting point of view. Okay, let's see what we can find by typing into authentication. Could the US have prevented the Russo-Ukrainian War? Here we are immediately taken to an opinion piece at MSNBC that appears to be well-sourced, entitled, Russia's Ukraine invasion may have been preventable. The U.S. refused to reconsider Ukraine's NATO status as Putin threatened war. Experts say That was a huge mistake. Here we are told, quote, by dangling the possibility of Ukraine's NATO membership for years but never fulfilling it, NATO created a scenario that emboldened Ukraine to act tough and buck Russia without any intention of directly defending Ukraine with its firepower if Moscow decided Ukraine had gone too far. The same article goes on, and again I quote, but for the West to offer compromise on Ukraine's future entry into NATO would have required admitting the limitation of Western power. It was the desire of Western governments not to lose face by compromising with Russia. Anatol Levin, a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and the author of Ukraine and Russia, Fraternal Rivalry, said, quote, but it was also the moral cowardice of so many Western commentators and officials and ex-officials who would not come out in public and admit that this was no longer a viable project. The West didn't want to set limits on NATO's enlargement and influence or lose face. So what it did was gamble. Levin told NBC. The MSNBC dataset goes on to quote George Beebe, a former director of Russia analysis at the CIA and special advisor to Russia for former Vice President Dick Cheney. According to Beebe, and I quote, the choice that we faced in Ukraine, and I'm using the past tense there intentionally, was whether Russia exercised a veto over NATO involvement in Ukraine on the negotiating table or on the battlefield. And we elected to make sure that the veto was exercised on the battlefield, hoping that either Putin would stay his hand or that the military operation would fail. Now for the interesting part of the MSNBC story. And again, I quote, in 1990, the West led the Soviets to believe NATO would not expand further eastward across Europe in exchange for Germany's reunification and the agreement that the new Germany would be a NATO member. Most famously, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker once assured Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that the NATO alliance would move not 1 inch eastward in exchange for this agreement. But as the late Princeton University scholar Stephen Cohen pointed out in 2018, this pledge was in fact made multiple times by several Western countries. These assurances were not honored, and NATO has expanded eastward over the years to include many more countries, all the way up to Russia's borders. It is the broken promise to Gorbachev that lingers as America's original sin, Cohen said then. Okay, let's type in, did U.S. national security officials do enough to bring Russia into the fold of a new post-Cold War world order? Here we find a data set at Fox News entitled, Former U.S. Security Officials. We did everything possible to bring Russia into international systems. The data set quotes former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice as saying, I will go out on a limb here and say that I think everybody from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration to the Obama administration to the Trump administration did everything possible to try and integrate Russia into the international system. The idea that somehow we tried to humiliate Russia, we tried to impose the kind of Versailles-like, it just isn't true. The same Fox article goes on to state, and I quote, former President Bill Clinton in April insisted he couldn't have done anything to prevent Russian President Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine, and denied his administration went out of its way to isolate, humiliate, or ignore the Russian leader, close quote. Finally, we come to this interesting data set at Radio Free Europe. telling us that President Putin did in fact discuss Russian membership in NATO during a meeting with President Clinton. According to the article that quotes President Putin, during the meeting I said we would consider an option that Russia might join NATO, Putin says. Clinton answered, I have no objection, but the entire U.S. delegation got very nervous, close quote. So that brings us to the conclusion of the Russo-Ukrainian war, getting into Vladimir Putin's head. We've now heard just a few different facts about what may be actually lurking in the head of Vladimir Putin as he continues to attack Ukraine. But the most important question in all of this is what you, the American people, think. Did we miss an opportunity to avoid war in Ukraine? What should be our next steps in Ukraine? Does Vladimir Putin think of himself as a butcher or a Russian patriot who feels betrayed by broken U.S. promises not to expand NATO? Does this justify Russia's attack on Ukraine? Or does Putin fear that an emerging democracy in Ukraine, if not stopped, would force Russia to change in ways that would further humiliate Russia, adversely impact Russia's future position on the global stage, and his own personal power? What do you think? It is what it is for September 12, 2022. This is John Hnatio reporting for the Objective News Network. We look forward to seeing your comments at our ONN blog. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you the next time.